So, we are about a month from the release of Steel Division Normandy 44 in beta, and it is the day in which the game actually gets released to the public. So I thought I'd just do a very short video detailing what I think about the game, and if I think that the game is actually worth the money, I will make a bit of a review of the multiplayer section of the game that has so far been released to me. I haven't played the campaign yet, but I might soon, and I might add an addendum to the review with the single player portion as well. To understand if the game is worth the asking price, I will ask three fundamental questions to the game and, of course, answer them with my own experiences. So, as always, obviously, this is my own opinion. It does not reflect any objective viewpoint about the game. The three questions are: does the game do what it says on the box, aka in the descriptions of the game, in the promo material of the game, and in general, what the view of Yugen and Paradox, who are obviously the publisher and the developer, if reflects the view that they seem to portray about the game. Second, is the game just fun? That's obviously probably the most important part. And three, is the game replayable? aka it doesn't maintain that fun and that, hopefully, fealty to its vision throughout multiple hours of game experience. That together will combine into if I think that the game is worth the asking price of €40/$40. So let's get right into this. So the first question is, does it do what it says on the box? Essentially, I will use the Steam game's description as a reference for this because it is the simplest way you can actually obtain information about the game. For a lot of people, this is what they're going to be basing their own opinion on the game without having played it on. And of course, if that is not right, then everything else falls apart. Now, the game is a tactical real-time strategy game, RTS, developed by Eugen Systems, who have also created the War Game and Ruse series of games. Two games that generally tend to try to immerse the player into what it feels to be a commander in a theater of war, with some moderate realism and elements of that sort. Nothing too hardcore, but also not a complete arcade experience. The game puts players in the command of detailed, historically accurate tanks, troops, and vehicles at the height of World War II. Players can measure their tactical skills against several opponents in big multiplayer battles or against enemies in a challenging single-player campaign, which of course I have not tried yet, so I will not express myself on that. Steel Division allows players to take control over legendary military divisions from 6 different countries, such as the American 101st Airborne, German 21st Panzer, or the 3rd Canadian Division during the invasion of Normandy in 1944. It puts players in command of a selection of historically accurate infantry, tanks, aircraft, and support vehicles to counter enemy units in a tactical RTS game. The battles rage over 3 distinct phases, where units unlock over time, mimicking their movements of real-world armies and adding variety to an ever-changing theater of war, and a dynamic front line illustrates the ebb and flow of conflict. Pin down the enemy infantry to gain the advantage and force a retreat, or push through with a perfectly executed plan. So this is supposed to be real-world tactics, then a real-world setting. Using the latest version of Eugen's Air Zoom engine, players can smoothly zoom from a tactical aerial view all the way down to a single unit and see 400 different real-world vehicles and units designed with careful historical detail and accuracy. Maps are designed based on actual aerial reconnaissance photos of Normandy in 1944, requiring real-world tactics and strategies to cover and control. That was real world setting, and so we have Outplan, Outsmart, and Outgun, the last part of the Steam description. From battle group customization to troop positioning and maneuvering, winning battles requires cunning and strategy, not just raw firepower. Each unit loss presents a growing tactical disadvantage, and players need to fight to gain and keep the upper hand. From commanding historically accurate troops to troop positioning and real-time engagement with the enemy, players will need to be clever and resourceful in order to win. Every unit counts as the battle presses on, and raw firepower alone will not be enough to claim victory. Whether viewing the entire battle from an air perspective or following a single unit into a firefight, players will need to cleverly manage the dynamic front line in order to execute ambushes and advances. This is not entirely wrong, actually. I will start by the sort of later part of that statement. I do kind of agree that in Steel Division 1944, players need to use a lot of tactics that sometimes are actually derived from the real world, in which case I would call the game, while not entirely lifelike and realistic, I can call the game at least enjoyably realistic, in that there's, of course, a lot of tactics that can't be represented in a game and should not be represented in a game because it would make the game unfun. But what Steel Division can do, it does pretty well. You do indeed feel like you are trying to set up ambushes and killing zones, and you're trying to, whenever you're executing a push, coordinate various different levels of combined arms with artillery, tanks, air support, and infantry to try and overcome hard challenges. And of course, in a multiplayer setting, this is easy because your opponents are real players just as you. So I cannot comment on how this will feel like in the campaign, but in the multiplayer, this combination works pretty much just fine. This is kind of helped by the fact that, just like the game says, there are a lot of different real world units that are combined into various different so-called battle groups that you create from historical rosters of divisions. So you can customize your divisions to a fairly high standard, although it isn't still quite as high as the customization options that you had in the wargame genre. But this is to be expected, as Steel Division Normandy 44 is very heavily focused upon one conflict that was a long time ago. Well, comparatively to the wargame series, was a long time ago, so there were less options even available realistically to the commanders back then, in terms of technology, in terms of course, machinery, and also in terms of troop numbers, etc., etc. Also in terms of nations involved in the conflict. And adding to that, the game decides to confine itself to the realm of Normandy 1944. Now, the game's timeline is between 6th of June 1944 to the end of the Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August. So the game in that, I think, makes a mistake because it confines itself to a very, very concise realm of operations, and that does not leave much actual room for variety, both in terms of in-game maps, of which we haven't seen all of them in the beta version, of course, so I cannot entirely be sure of that in the final product, but also in terms of unit variety. There are only, well, of course, quote unquote only, there are a lot of units in the game, but most of them, even though they're different, they're actually very similar because they're just different types of the same unit, just maybe controlled by a different army, maybe controlled by a different division, maybe slightly different in their specifications. Maybe one of them is the amphibious version of another unit, which is of course normally fine, and we see something like this in Wargame as well. However, in Steel Division Normandy 44, because of the very restricted timeline, we have what can be essentially called a artificial restriction on the number and variety of units, which I called it a bad thing, but it can also be a good thing because it can also lead to increased game balance overall. If there had been more units right off the bat, especially from a position of an RTS that is trying to, of course, attract players not just on the basis of its historical accuracy, which it does fairly well, but also on the basis of its game balance, trying to attract maybe a more competitive crowd for, of course, multiplayer matches, then, of course, game balance is a very important aspect. My personal opinion on the game balance so far, even though this isn't really part of the first question, is that it's fine. I'll go into more depth later in the second part. Going on over the free phases. The free phases do kind of sometimes limit your options, but I think they overall add to the game, and they add both a tactical element to the actual battle, and very nicely they add kind of a metagame element with how you build your decks, because different divisions have different levels of strength, different types of units in different phases of the battle, and sometimes they actually have unique units that you can bring on the battlefield very early on or very late game that can then be used to turn the tide of the battle in one way or another, which of course adds to the variety of the various different divisions. I think that the system could use some tweaking, partially also due to the income system, because you get a certain amount of points every minute in Steel Division, and that's how you purchase units with these points. So the economy is very simple. You cannot do anything in the game's normal conquest mode, which is what most people play. You cannot do anything to increase or decrease your income except wait for a new phase. Some divisions have different incomes in different phases, and that sometimes can create imbalances and such. Sometimes it could be used to create game balance overall, but hey, that's just something that it will have to be tweaked later with patches. So overall, does the game indeed do what it says on the box? Well, it mostly does. It provides a enjoyable tactical experience with lots of real-world mechanics such as combat stress, panic, artillery support off map, the interplay between, of course, various different types of armored vehicles, the fact that units have multiple different types of weapons that they can use while not necessarily being effective at all those roles. And so you have to, of course, use combined arms, but then remember that just because a unit looks like it's supposed to do something, it doesn't mean that it cannot do anything else. This game does not rely upon a rock, paper, scissors type of game balance, type of game structure like other games in the genre. It really more relies on some units are really good at something, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely completely worthless at other things. And that's something that I like. Adding versatility to your arsenal isn't something that's too hard to do, but it's something that's kind of hard to actually employ correctly, because you need to keep in mind what tens of different units that are present on the battlefield are able to do, and that's not easy. And that's something that also kind of adds to the enjoyment of the game. So I do rate this as a yes. I think it does do what it says on the box, with some reservations, such as, of course, partially the graphics and the sound design are very, very lacking. That's a bit of a minor point that I would have to give it to the game. But overall, these are, I think, secondary to the gameplay overall. And we have never, well, we've, of course, actually played a lot of strategy games with really bad graphics and even worse sound design overall.
See, you're
So I
fixing
don't
all
think
right.
this is too
We'll
bad.
have a better chance now, eh? Time to drive the Germans out of the village and chase them till they reach Berlin.
Okay, Captain. Armor like that will take us all the way to Berlin.
The second question is the game fun to play? Now, this is, of course, a very important and very subjective viewpoint, so I encourage you to look at game videos, maybe even try to buy the game and then keep the refund option open, because this is very subjective and probably the most important part as to whether or not the game will be worth your money. And considering also what I said earlier, with the game's kind of unique well, sort of unique model that it can kind of also execute fairly well, I would say that for me the game is fun. And so, yes, it says indeed a yes. I think the game is fun. Now, addendum, I don't really think that some of the features of the game could be as sort of, or rather are right now, as well refined as they could be. Of course, I played the game in a beta, so that is something that you have to keep in mind. But for example, I think that the way aircraft work could be rebalanced in some way, because they do provide a lot of frustrations sometimes, the way some units do their pathfinding, etc., etc., and the way, of course, sometimes you just see random things pop up without too much trouble. Those can all kind of detract from the game experience. Also, the frontline system sometimes reduces the amount of fun the game has, because it's sometimes very unclear how exactly your frontline stacks up to the enemy, and because the victory points in the game that actually grant you victory after a certain time or not are based on the frontline system, and sometimes it looks like you have control over more sections of the map than the enemy, but indeed the points are being given over to the enemy. That's just a very minor nitpick from me. In other games, like in Wargame, you have different zones that you capture. In Company of Heroes, you have, of course, victory points that are present on the map that you capture. And so in those games, it's very, very clear when you are winning or when you are losing the game. In Steel Division, it's not that easy to actually figure out sometimes if you're supposed to have over half the map or if you're not. And that's something that sometimes leads to frustrations, as you think you're doing fine, or you think you're doing well. Sometimes you think you're doing terrible, and then you find out that actually you've been winning the entire time if you haven't been looking at the scoreboard. And sometimes you find out the opposite. So that's just a bit of a nitpick from me. And the third question is the game replayable? In my opinion, so far, this is the main problem. As I said, the battle groups, because of the insistence of the game developers to focus just on the Normandy 1944 scenario for their game, the battle groups can feel repetitive, and sometimes they can also feel like they're kind of forced, as in they're not really that different from each other, and they just force the existence of different battle groups to make sure that they can put it as an advertisement that there are 18 different armies. And so maybe a player thinks, in the same vein as Wargame has 18, well, lots of different armies. I do not know the exact number. And in Wargame, of course, the armies are very different from each other, but sometimes they have similarities. In Steel Division, it's more the opposite. They're mostly similar and sometimes have differences. And that can, of course, distract from replayability, as you are sometimes forced to use the same strategies over and over because of a simple lack of viable alternatives. So that's something that I think kind of detracts from the game. Of course, it is a multiplayer real-time strategy game with quite a lot of depth. So overall, I don't really see this as too much of a problem, because mostly the replayability is based on how the developers will let players actually play the game. If they will be able to balance the game enough so that it will be viable to have various different strategies, then players will find these various different strategies, and you will meet them whenever you play the game online. So it isn't anything out of the ordinary for a strategy game to start off maybe looking like it's not going to be that good, but then over time, with patching work, with balancing work, people of course finding out new types of strategy that are viable, then that problem might just disappear overall. Of course, it might not, and that's why I'm going to put it as a maybe. So overall, I think that while the game does have its problems, the fact that the price isn't 60 euros but it is 40 euros kind of means that if you have the money, then, and if of course you like these types of games, of course, by these types of games I mean games like Wargame and Ruse, then the game might be worth a buy. Now, the other big demographic that I think is going to be looking to try out this game is people coming in from games like Company of Heroes, which aren't quite as large on the scale, they aren't quite as diverse on the tactics, and they could be called more arcadey. I'm not entirely sure whether or not this crowd will entirely enjoy the game. If you enjoy, for example, certain types of realism mods for Company of Heroes, then you might also not like the game, because the game sometimes feels arcadey in some areas. For example, how units move around and how units destroy each other. But overall, if you enjoy the tactical diversity of Company of Heroes that sometimes the game can offer, and you want something that brings more of that, more options to how you win the game, more options to how you approach the territory and terrain of the maps, then this game, I think, will offer a lot of value for you, because the way you can use the terrain, the way you can use various different units combined with each other, and the way, in general, the battle sort of ebbs and flows between different areas is really quite fun to play and quite good. So if you enjoy an RTS with those kinds of things, rather than RTSs that purely focus on the realism and the historical accuracy, or purely focus on, of course, actions per minute, adrenaline-like fun, then Seal Division might be a game for you. It's a game where you have to think about tactics and you have to be at least savvy enough to execute them, but that doesn't focus too hard on actual micromanaging of units and actual, well, of course, point for point realism, such as something like a theater of war or gravity tactics. It's not that type of game. It's not a full on war game, and it's not a Company of Heroes either. It's not a StarCraft, but it is an interesting mixture of the two in some areas that some players are going to like. As always, this is just my opinion. So you can, well, you can have different opinions. You can not like the game because of one reason or another. This is just what I think, and what I think for, of course, people who have different tastes than me. So I'm not gonna be entirely right on everything. Other than that, I want to thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed the review, and I'll see you soon.